right, hey there, everybody. A couple days ago, I posted an image in the church photography team group on Facebook, and the reaction just absolutely blew up. What the image was a image with really bad lighting that I captured this past weekend in our auditorium, and the result of where I was able to recover that image. And we had comments like, "What is this, witchcraft? What? How in the world did you do this?" And so I wanted to take just a minute to show you how I would think through recovering an image like this. I actually keep a whole Lightroom folder in my Lightroom library of images like this with before and afters that we'll go back and I can show you some examples of those as well. But specifically, this is the image that I'm talking about. This is an image completely purple, super underexposed. I was exposed for stage, obviously. I saw a member of our congregation kind of in a moment of worship with my 70 to 200 lens. I dropped my shutter speed as low as I could go. I turned, I got the shot, and this is what came out. Obviously, this isn't anything remotely usable, but this is the after. And so if you take a look at the before and after here, you notice big difference. This could possibly be a usable image. And so I want to go over a couple of things. One, I want to go over exposure. Two, I want to go over color. And three, I want to go over sharpening, because when you take an image that is this dark and you crank up the exposure, you're often prone to noise. So let's get into how to make this image into this image. Here we go. So the first thing I do when I'm approaching an image is I actually have a couple of presets that I've put together that cover a lot of the basic steps that I would take the first time I open an image and approach an image. I'm going to do this to almost every one of my images. And so in my presets folder, I call it basic setup concert. I do a lot of concert photography. And so I'm going to apply that preset really quickly, walk through what it does. Notice my profile now changes from Adobe Color to Adobe Vivid. I like that vivid profile. I shoot on Nikon, and so it's not as vivid often as my Canon counterparts, so I like that extra little bit of contrast and color. A couple other things that it does is it adds just a touch of clarity, gives me a little bit of a vignette, and then it will also add something that we will address here in just a moment, which is sharpening and noise reduction. And then finally, the last thing it does is it, in your optics settings, it removes that chromatic aberration, which could be part of your image from the lenses that you're using, and also enables lens corrections. So that's what that basic setup preset does. Nothing yet with the actual exposure or color or anything like that from this image. So the very first thing I do after I've set my basic setup plugin or my basic setup preset is I just hit the auto button and I see what comes out. And obviously this is no better than where we started. So we've got now, instead of dark purple, we've got bright purple. But overall the exposure is pretty good for us to work with at a starting point. A lot of times if you're using images in a dark environment or a very contrasty stage environment, that auto setting button isn't going to get you anywhere remotely close to where you want to be. This is pretty good. So I'm going to start here and I'm going to start looking at color now, because obviously our color is not where it needs to be. So I'm going to open the color tab in Lightroom. By the way, it's worth noting I am editing in Lightroom CC on my iPad. My workflow at this point is almost entirely mobile, almost entirely iPad based. And so I'll do a whole new tutorial on that at some point. But I am using Lightroom CC on iPad. I love it. I love the tactile nature of being able to touch and move stuff. So color tab. I'm in the color tab and I want to draw your attention to two different things that have to deal with color. And you see this on the right hand side in the sidebar. You see temperature and you see tint. Temperature is going to be how warm or cool that image is. We use that language to describe it. It's in a specific value called Kelvin. The second thing is tint though, and tint comes in handy when you're talking about, if you're shooting under fluorescent light, you might have noticed that your images are kind of green. That's because fluorescent light has a green tint. Often stage lights might be, like LEDs, might be a little blue, a little purple, and so you gotta correct those just a little bit green. Here, all of the light that's in this image came off of a reflection of what was up on the stage. So we've got, in our auditorium, is sometimes you might have a little bit of overhead light, but we have our house lights dim during the worship set. You have whatever color is being blasted onto your worship team from the front, typically like a warmer orange or kind of neutral light on the front, and then you have whatever's coming from behind. And so from behind the worship team, you're going to have maybe some colored lights on the wall that are projecting up and then bouncing back. You might have actual lights that are going out into the congregation. And so during this particular moment, we had a lot of purple light. And so I'm going to show you how to use these two sliders to correct this very, very super extreme example of colored light. This doesn't always work. It works better for purples than it does for, say, blues. But here's what I do. So the very first thing I notice is it's super purple. Which of these two sliders do I need to change? The tint, which is a scale from purple to green. I don't want to go toward purple, so I'm going to counteract purple just by sliding my tint all the way to the left until it looks about right. Notice we've gotten a little bit of purple out of this image, but it's still not quite there. It's still like if you, we're looking at skin tones. So if I'm looking at her skin tones, I see there's still a lot of orange that shouldn't be there. It's still very warm. And so for the same principle, I'm going to take my temperature slider now. And I'm going to slide that also toward blue. And notice that just by doing that, I'm not going to go quite all the way because that makes it a little too blue, a little too green. But by backing that off just a little bit, now I've got pretty natural skin tones, and all I've done was slide those two sliders. That's not something that you would have known to do if you just hit auto white balance, it probably wouldn't have done that. That's not something that comes intuitive to you to think, well, hey, let's just adjust these two sliders and get this image. Normally, you would see this image and you'd see it and it's like, well, that's garbage. I absolutely can't use it. And so here, just by sliding two sliders, we've gotten pretty close. But there's some things that still irk me about this image. So I don't like necessarily that there's still a lot of purple here in the background. When I first shared this, I got some feedback that said I might have taken a little bit too much out. This is kind of a personal preference thing. And then here, notice because we had a little bit of natural light on her hand, where I shifted that tint all the way to green, now she's got like this weird green alien hand. And so we're going to talk about how to deal with that. So the very first thing is I've made my very basic color adjustments, but now I can go into the color mix and I can adjust the hue, saturation, and luminance of specific colors within the rainbow. So you see all the different hues in the rainbow here. Hue is basically like, is it red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, or violet? It's the actual color that we're talking about. Saturation is how much of that color is there, and then luminance is how bright or how prominent is that color throughout the image. And so how much we can change the luminance of, let's say his blue shirt here was probably in the teal range. If I adjust this up, you can see kind of those teals in his shirt are becoming lighter and darker. That's what luminance does. And so now that I've got my color, I'm going to hit the auto button again real quick and see what happens. Now, because as you change your color temperature, your auto settings will vary a little bit. Before I get to manipulating the specific colors, I'm going to get this image about where I would like it exposed, and then we'll deal with the color corrections. So to me, it still feels a little underexposed. I would probably boost that exposure just a touch, and I'd probably pull shadows up just a touch, because I like to have a little bit of extra lightness in my image. And so I feel like this is pretty good. Let's go back to our color tab. Let's go into our color mix and let's see what we can do about green alien hand and some of the other weird things that are going on here. Like I said, skin tones are pretty good. When I'm looking at color, my first and primary concern is getting skin tones right, because if your pastor looks like an Oompa Loompa and he's bright orange, that's not going to fly well. So you want to get skin tones right. So I'm going to focus in on the hand here. And so the reason we got here is we shifted everything green. There was a little bit of natural white light on that hand. And so when I shifted white light green, white light becomes green. So all of our purples went to a natural tone. Our white light went to something unnatural. I got to correct for that. So I'm just going to tap. There's two different areas where we can get greens. One is in the green hue, and then also second is in the yellow hue. So often when I'm combating greens, I'm going to go into yellow, and then I'm going to take the hue and I'm going to shift it all the way to orange. And see, notice that right there, we've got a much more natural skin tone. We've combated that green. We didn't do it in the green hue, we did it in the yellow hue, because yellows can also go very green. If we actually want her to have alien hands, we can do that as well. So I'm taking that, that yellow hue, I am dragging it all the way to the orange side, so it is more orange, takes that green out, and right away we've already solved that problem. I might actually just desaturate yellows a little bit too, to get that about to where I would imagine a accurate skin tone would be. So that's just preference from there. I think we have a pretty usable image here. All I did was manipulate 3 sliders to go from completely unusable to usable image. But I'm going to tweak this just a little bit more. Now you want to be careful because you don't want to over process, you don't want to make things look unnatural. I do want to get rid of some of the purple here in the background, and so I'm just going to go to my purple and my magenta in my color mix, and I'm just going to kind of desaturate some of that, and you can experiment. So if I pull this all the way up, you can see where some purples start to show up. Still here in his shoulder, you can still see some purples there in the shoulder, and then the background as well. As I drag up and down, you'll see how that saturation changes in the background too. So I'm going to drag it down a little bit, desaturate that, and do the same with the magentas. I'm just going to experiment here and see what happens when I oversaturate, see how that has become much more prominent. We know that there's more magenta there in the background than actual purple, and so I'm going to desaturate some of that. Based on some feedback I got when I shared this image, I'm going to leave just a little bit though, just to reflect, you know, the ambiance that was in the auditorium at that time. So I think from a color perspective, from a exposure perspective, we're pretty good here. The last thing that people noticed was like, wow, it's a really sharp image. So I'm going to talk about a couple things real quick. Technical settings of my camera, and then we're going to talk about how to combat noise in Lightroom as well. So first thing is first, let's take a look at the settings at which this camera, or this image was captured. You can do that under the Info tab. We see that I was shooting at 1/100th of a second here, shooting at f2.8, which is wide open, and shooting at ISO 2500. And so, you know, generally speaking, when you're shooting with a 70 to 200 lens, you want your shutter speed to be faster than the focal length in millimeters. So if I'm shooting at 200 millimeters, which we see that this image was taken, I should be shooting at 1/200th of a second, but I use Tamron's G2 70 to 200 lens, which gives me 4.5 stops of vibration control. So I can shoot 4.5 stops slower and still get a clear image, notwithstanding any motion blur from the subject. Just my camera shake will be compensated for. So that's how I can get that shutter speed so low. Obviously I want to get that shutter speed down so I can get more light and get even as close as I got with that original image. Second, aperture wide open. So typically if you're going to shoot in a dark environment, you want to get as much light as you can. The lower your f-stop number, the more light your camera is letting in, and therefore you get more light. And then finally ISO. If you're not familiar with ISO, it's how much light your sensor will soak up. So how sensitive is my sensor to the data, the light data that's hitting it. The higher the ISO, the brighter generally the image will be. The lower the ISO, the darker the image will be, because your sensor is less sensitive with the lower ISO. The trade-off though is that as you crank your ISO up, you get what's called noise. And if we pixel peep on this, so if we get in real close, you can see the noise in the background of this image. It's all these speckly dots. And noise comes from when your sensor is picking up that data. If it's more sensitive, it's going to be a little bit more noisy, particularly in darker areas that we have brought up from a dark shadow. So we've brought up the exposure here, we've introduced noise, and now we need to get rid of the noise. So let's talk about how to do that. The way that we combat noise is in the Detail tab. There's 2 areas that we're going to look at. First is sharpening, second is noise reduction. So sharpening does what it sounds like. It's going to make the image slightly sharper. It's going to take the edges, it's going to enhance those edges. And then the second thing is noise reduction, which does exactly what it sounds like. It's going to reduce noise. Both of these have trade-offs though. So with noise reduction, if I zoom in real close on her face, I'm going to take my noise reduction, which is set at 22 based on the preset I used. Typically this would be at 0. But if I crank this all the way up, you're going to notice that as soon as this processes, notice I lose a lot of detail. Now her face is kind of like smooth and creamy, but you lose some of the definition. There's no noise there, obviously. Like all that noise that we were looking at is completely gone. But now people kind of look soft, you kind of look like photoshopped and airbrushed, and that's not a look that we want to go for. So I'm going to take my noise reduction back down, probably for this image, leave it around 30. There we have that detail back, but we also still have some noise. Going to talk about that. Our sharpening can help us with the that airbrush look that the noise reduction can introduce. So typically when you start out with your sharpening, it's going to be around 40. I bump it up to around 80. I know, just based on experiments and editing images over the long haul, about from which ISO can I introduce more sharpening and which ISO can I introduce less sharpening. The reason your ISO matters and noise matters is because when you sharpen, you're also sharpening any detail in that image, including the noise that we've introduced by shooting at a higher ISO and bumping up our exposure. So that's where this masking tab comes in. So you see under sharpening, you might have to open this if it's not already open for you, but there's a masking option within sharpening, and this is the magic and where the magic happens. And so masking is going to say what parts of the image do we actually want to sharpen, because right now it's probably sharpening the noise, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to do. We want to minimize the noise. We want to maximize the sharpening of the actual details in our image. Masking will solve this problem. So if you're on the iPad, as you adjust this slider, you'll just touch the image, and as you do, you'll see what parts of the image that this slider is affecting. If you're doing this on your desktop, you'll hold either the Alt key or the Option key, depending on whether you're on Windows or Mac, as you adjust this slider, and you'll see what parts of the image are being affected. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to slide this masking up. I'm going to tap the image, and now it's going to go weird black and white outline, and now I can see which parts of the image are being masked. So if I bring that masking down, notice I can see that I am editing, or I'm masking out the noise. You see all those speckles in the background. But if I bring this up and I hold down my image while I'm doing it, I can see that mask, the white areas, are going down to the details. So I want to find the spot where, like here, I'm masking noise. I want to go up. I want to mask less noise. I only want to mask details. And then voila, we have our image. And so here's what we've gone from. We've gone from this horrible, underexposed purple image to a very usable image that we could see on the front page of our website or on our Instagram channels. It's not perfect. There are some, I don't have the exact skin tones that I might want out of this image, but just by sliding two sliders, setting some basic adjustments, and then tweaking with our color mix, we've been able to make an image that looks great. And that is how you recover a very underexposed and poorly colored image. Before we go, I want to show you just a couple of other quick examples of images that I've done this with, and I want to challenge you to do this with an image as well. So I'm going to go back to my library here and just flip through a couple of these. So here's one straight off camera. This is what it looked like. Again, very, very dark corner. This was on stage, but our choir. Sometimes you can't get color right. So this is very blue. Blues are much harder because there's no skin tones in that range of the color spectrum. And so this one, I just went black and white. Did all the same things. I did my sharpening, I did my masking, I did my noise reduction, and then exposed for the color that I want. Again, straight off the camera, this image would never be usable, but now we have a usable image. Here's another one. This one started out here. Again, blues a little tougher. You can't really get those natural skin tones, but we've been able to up the exposure, sharpen our image, color correct. This is one of my favorite images. Complete accident. Just happened to hit it at the right moment as a little pop of light was happening on stage. This is where that image started. So again, not the greatest light. We have lots of haze, but through experimentation, through messing with our color sliders, I was able to get a very attractive and appealing image. Here's another example, very blue. We recovered some of the skin tones out of the natural lights that's available, and we got a usable image. Here you see no image at all, but through the same process, we were able to get something that's almost black to a usable image. Again, this one's gonna be super noisy and super grainy, but That's just what happens when you bump up that exposure so much. Fun moment in the middle of one of our services that otherwise we wouldn't be able to use. Tons more of these. Here's an almost black image, but hey, there's a person hanging out there that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. This one, again, almost black. We recovered both the blues out of that image and the exposure. Got a pretty natural looking image through a drum kit of a guy in the front row of our congregation. Here's one of our volunteers in the photo booth, or in the production booth. Very dark, really hard to get. Same principles. Here's a baptism photo. Had some funky colored lights, funky colored water. Made that water look a little less like the slime and more like water. And images after images that we've done this with. This is another one of my favorites. This was at a concert, not in a church service, but again, almost black. Nobody else got this image. I just happened to grab it and was like, let's see what I can get. Recovery, got a really cool image of Randy Carlisle on stage. Super funky colors. Sometimes you have to go black and white. Here's a blue recovery that I've done. You get some natural skin tones out there. It's still a little stylized, not perfect, but much better than that. Yellows are often difficult as well. So there's a nice clean image out of a very yellow image. And again, here's some dark purples in a friend's church that I was able to recover some natural skin tones for. So all of these images done with the exact same techniques, looking at, analyzing the image for what colors are there, and figuring out which way we need to shift which sliders and compensating for those colors, and then using the tools that we have available in Lightroom to make a usable image. So that's how it's done. If you have any questions, let me know. Drop a comment on this video, and then I want to challenge you to do this yourself. So go back through your library, find an image or two that you're like, that will never ever work, that's a hideous image, and then try to recover. I should have said this at the beginning. This is why we shoot RAW, because all of this is possible because the data is, the light data is stored in that RAW file. So if I could, I would cut this out, put this at the beginning, shoot RAW on your camera. You can never ever ever do this with JPEGs. So shoot RAW. Okay, that's all we got time for today. Thanks for joining me.